Wayne Brittenden's Counterpoint. Good morning, Wayne. I hope you're there. Now, for today's issue. Earlier this month, an unexpectedly brief and undetailed report was released by the WHO, the World Health Organization, addressing allegations by a number of medical experts over the years about the effects on the Iraqi population of shell casings and other weapon debris laced with depleted uranium, dating back to the Gulf War, you remember, 1990-91. The WHO report finds no cause for alarm, but it runs counter to the findings of other scientific inquiries. In 1991, a UK Atomic Energy Authority report predicted that if fewer than 10% of the particles released by the depleted uranium weapons used in Iraq and Kuwait were inhaled, it could result in as many as 300,000 deaths. So, what's going on here? Wayne takes up the story of the unalarming but far from uncontroversial new WHO report.
The extraordinary thing about this report is its brevity and the fact that it's anonymous. That's unusual in epidemiological reporting. Health professionals need to know the detailed methodology, the sources of data, and crucially, who to contact with any questions. But no, in essence, it simply says that it finds no evidence of any increase in leukemias and birth deformities. There's no comparison of statistics between districts that were exposed to the bombardments and those that weren't. Such a study should include a breakdown of different hospital districts. Its finding, if it can be dignified with that term, flies in the face of medical evidence on the ground. After months of bombing, the planes and cruise missiles left behind tons of shell casings, bullets and bomb fragments laced with depleted uranium. Iraq's health minister says that he has proof, and his ministry holds that all studies show damning evidence of a dramatic rise in leukemias and birth defects. That was last March, barely 6 months before the anonymous WHO report that saw no clear evidence. Dr. Jawad Al-Ali is an Iraqi oncologist, a member of Britain's Royal Society of Physicians. His findings show that more than 40% of the population of Basra will get cancer. Most of the victims are civilians, especially children who inevitably play in the radioactive dust. The Bulletin of Environmental Contamination and Toxicology studied the number of defects per 1,000 live births in a maternity hospital for a year from 1994, then again at the same hospital in 2003. They found that in less than a decade, the number of congenital birth defects was 17 times higher. In 2004, a WHO expert report on the long-term health effects of depleted uranium was held secret. It remains confidential to this day. That report was undertaken by 3 leading radiation scientists, and it had a great deal to say about cancers to come from breathing that dust. The main author was Dr. Keith Baverstock, WHO's chief expert on radiation and health for 11 years. He says bluntly that his report was deliberately suppressed. The WHO denies it, so where is it? And here we go again. A WHO and Iraqi Health Ministry report on cancers and birth defects was supposed to have come out last November, but publication's been repeatedly delayed. Almost a year later, there's still no release date. Both of these reports conflict with the WHO's insistence that the depleted uranium dust isn't any risk to the population. So, what's causing the spectacular rise in birth defects? The WHO won't say, and although it's in defiance of its own mandate, it won't let us see those reports, compiled by radiation experts that they had appointed, and by medical teams working in the field. Well, the former UN Assistant Secretary General, Hans von Sponeck, was also humanitarian coordinator in Iraq. He says that the US government tried to prevent the WHO from surveying areas in southern Iraq where depleted uranium had been used. The organization's strapped for cash and under less bold leadership than in times past. It's much more vulnerable to intense pressure from governments and powerful interests. If it succumbed over those independent reports on depleted uranium, what other important public health issues isn't it telling us about? The WHO's overriding concern is supposed to be the health of the world's citizens and the absolute independence of its experts. free from political and special interest interference. If it loses that, it's lost the reason for its very existence.
Thank you, Wayne. Very interesting. Now, on the line from his hotel in Shanghai, I have the former UN Assistant Secretary General, just mentioned by Wayne. Hans van Sponneck has held a number of high UN development posts over many years in many countries. He was responsible for directing all UN humanitarian operations in Iraq, but resigned in February 2000 in protest against international policy towards Iraq, including sanctions. He's also the author of several books on development, as well as numerous papers and articles. Good morning, Hans.
Good morning to you.
Thank you for your time here. What is actually going on?
Well, that's a very good question.
Yes.
I am as puzzled as you and as Wayne is, because what, of course, one would have expected at this point is that the WHO emerges as a lead party in finally, after all these years, since the late 1990s, that we finally have evidence of what lay people, but not even just the laymen, the professional community expects to see confirmed, and that is that there has been an immense impact on the public health in different parts of Iraq, where depleted uranium and white phosphorus were used, and that is primarily Basra and its environment, but also Fallujah in central Iraq, and that hasn't happened as far as that brief report, which is really an acceptable document from the World Health Organization, should have disclosed. So we are puzzled, and I would even add a word, I'm angry, that the evidence which I myself have seen in the Child and Mother Hospital in Basra, for example, with deformities that I'd imagine could exist anywhere, that this evidence doesn't translate now into a serious admission or confirmation that there's a need for even more research, but there's a need to bring into the open the misuse and the horrific impact of depleted uranium on public health in Iraq, and then see it in a wider context of similar situations that have evolved in the Balkans, Afghanistan, and elsewhere.
People will be puzzled by the fact that an international organization can formally commission and publicly, I assume, particular reports, and yet these do not arrive in the public domain. And take me through the governance arrangements of WHO which enable that to happen.
Well, it shouldn't happen. There's no government arrangement. It's very clear that a World Health Organization, a UNESCO, United Nations institution, anywhere should be recognized and respected as an independent international body that is trying to be the arbiter and the calibrator, if you want, of the international debate, to make sure that unfiltered, non-political, non-ideological information is injected into the debate. That is the role of the United Nations, and the officials that work in that institution are in fact bound by an oath which every single civil servant is delivering, and that is an oath that she will remain independent and unaffected by pressures which shouldn't exist. That's also in the UN Charter, that governments, anyone, any outside institution should leave the work of the officials alone, not interfere. So it's very clear. And WHO, I cannot and I should not pass judgment here, but WHO obviously is a very important player in this arena, and they obviously have had a problem.
Obviously, the various governments who might have an interest in this particular issue have not said a great deal, if anything. But presumably the head of WHO, or at least some of the senior staff of WHO, have got to say something when they're asked a direct question: where are these reports? What has actually happened in terms of that debate?
Well, I think this is a question that the government of New Zealand and other governments should now ask WHO. WHO, its head, must now face these accusations.
Has nobody formally asked the WHO for an explanation yet, publicly?
Well,
has it not come up in the General Assembly or anywhere else?
I mean, it's not, well, the General Assembly can do that. I think it has reached a situation where that would be called for. But the WHO has what is called the Annual Health Assembly. This is their body.
Yeah.
All member countries come together, and that should obviously be a subject of a very serious discussion. The public, and not only the public, also the victims, if they're still alive,
yes,
needs to know what has happened, how it is possible. Let's come back to this report. I was truly shocked when I read what looked as if there was a whitewash.
Yes. In an age in which nothing, it seems, can be held back, nothing is not leakable, it seems amazing that the reports haven't appeared through other sources, but they don't seem to have got out. Does that surprise you? I mean, it would surprise anybody that's listening, I would imagine.
I don't want to speculate here too much, but the fact is we have an inadequate document. The fact is that there are a range of professionals who have done work. There is a woman in Italy, Dr. Manduca, who has devoted her professional life in recent years to this very issue. There are others you mentioned. There is Dr. Suad Al-Hadithi, who is also very active in this area. So there are professionals who say this cannot be, and that in itself demands from the World Health Organization a response.
When we talk about the governments who would have an interest in this, who are we talking about here? I mean,
well, I have no hesitation to mention that the problem that I myself witnessed in this context, but also in others, was the United States government at the time. They put pressure on us also to, for example, when I served in Iraq, we moved, can you imagine, we moved 440,000 tons of food every month. And the distribution of this food via 54,000 food agents worked very well. And it was not political. And yet, we in Baghdad were told by Washington at the time and by London that the food distribution was not working there. It worked extremely well. We had food agents, we had ration cards, it worked.
yeah.
Same way when I had resigned from my post in Baghdad, I lived in Geneva, I had contact with a person in the World Health Organization who had been asked to lead a delegation to southern Iraq. This was in the early 2000s, and to look into this issue of the depleted uranium. And the mission never materialized for two reasons. One was that the Iraqi government was expected to contribute finance. They said nothing doing. This is a problem which outside. It should also be financed from outside. I thought this was a mistake that they reacted this way. But then there was that allegation that came about that the delegation had been discouraged by the UN at that time. I emphasized it. But there's a link. I mean, there seems to be a history of suppression.
You mentioned before white phosphorus. Depleted uranium and white phosphorus appear to have been discovered there. Where would that have come from?
Well,
there's a link here between the whole weapons of mass destruction.
I can tell you that in 2003, Iraq had no depleted uranium of its own or white phosphorus. It came in from outside forces that were in Fallujah. This was the central belt, what we today call the Sunni belt. In Fallujah, the U.S. military operated. So it's not an unfair conspiracy theory to say it came from the supplies of the U.S. and the depleted uranium, despite the experience that has been made not only by the civilian population, but also by their own military. I mean, how many cases do we have now? In 1991, in 2003, it seems similar munition was used again.
Yes. It does seem ironic, doesn't it, that after all the fuss about whether or not Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, it now seems quite likely that the answer was no, but that other people had the equivalent.
Yeah, but I mean, to call it ironic is one way of putting it. Another way is criminal.
Well, yes, you've said it. Well, we'll watch this. It'll be very interesting to see what happens. Thank you very much for your time. That was Hans von Skolnick. He is the former UN Assistant Secretary General and was responsible for directing all UN humanitarian operations in Iraq and resigned in February 2000. I can believe every word he says.